Welcome to Lab 18, question 1. The highest GDP according to Table 26.1 is China. The highest GDP per person is the United States. The second highest GDP is the United States. And the second highest GDP per person is Germany. Question 2. The GDP includes all services and all goods. Question 3. Spending on medical services and recreational activities has increased by more than 10 times their level in the 1950s.
For question 4, in this case, the speedometer measures how far you would travel if you were traveling at your current speed for 1 whole hour. Similarly, when GDP gets reported, per quarter, the government reports the current number multiplied by 4 to account for the 4 quarters in the whole year. For question 5, we use the formula of previous year GDP minus current year GDP, current year GDP minus previous year GDP divided by previous year GDP times 100 to work out the percentage change in GDP. For part A, it is negative 13.4%, part B, negative 19%, part C, it's positive 4.18%. For question 6, we are asked if a number of situations add to the US GDP. For part A, used cars sold at used car stores do not count towards US GDP since sales of goods are not counted. Similarly, in part B, used car sold at cousin's garage sale also doesn't account towards GDP. For part C, wine made in Napa Valley at a vineyard owned by Australians does account to the US GDP, since the good is manufactured in America and it does not matter what nationality the workers or property owners are. For part D, however, this wine made in Australia by Americans does not count towards the US GDP, since the good is made outside of America. Part E, a French tourist staying at a San Francisco hotel will account for the US GDP, since the French tourist is consuming a service that is located in America. However, for part F, an American tourist staying at a hotel in Paris does not count towards the US GDP, since they are consuming a service located outside of America. And finally, for part G, a ticket for a Lakers game, this does count towards US GDP since the services that is located in America.
For question 7, it asks, by definition, is nominal GDP higher than real GDP? This is true because nominal GDP is going to be higher because of inflation. Since goods cost more with inflation, nominal GDP will go up without an increase in production. For question 8, looking back over the last 10,000 years of human history, which is more normal, for the GDP per capita to grow or for it to stay the same? Generally, that would be for it to stay the same, because for most of the 10,000 years of human history, we've done similar things and haven't really increased our production all that much. For question 9, for part A, it asks, what was the highest level of real GDP prior to the 2008 recession? And that was $15.761 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2007. And then for part B, what year and quarter did the U.S. real GDP exceed this number in part A? And that would be in quarter 2 of 2011 when it got to $15.825 trillion. For question 10, part 1, it's just the graph. And then for part 2, question B, in the 2009 recession, which series fell by the most? And that would be the real investment. If you look at the graph, you can see that. And then for part C, in the first quarter of 2010, what share of GDP was made up by consumption? And then, so that would mean you take the amount of consumption and divide it by the sum of all 4 parts of the real GDP, and then you get to 21.5% of the GDP.
For question 11, we are asked what the national spending identity is. So the national spending identity is an approach to measuring GDP, where the GDP is split into consumption, national investment, government spending, and net exports, giving us the formula Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. And so for question 11, we are then asked to calculate the GDP given the terms and values up in the question. So after using the equation that's given above, the formula is given above, we can see that the GDP in this case is $150. So for question 13A, the GDP is comprised of consumption and investments, and consumption is £4,000, while investments from his 2 huts come up to £400. This gives us a GDP of £4,400. And then for part B, seeing as his personal consumption goes down by 500, but then he starts exporting 500. His consumption goes down to 3,500 and his exports go up to 500. But he also imports 2,000 pounds worth of goods. This comes out that his GDP comes up to 2,400 pounds. For part C, he stops importing completely, but then he continues to export his 500 pounds worth of fish, and he also exports his 2 huts that were stolen from him. This means that his GDP goes back to 4,400 pounds. Then for part D, assuming that he continues to not import anything from the village, his exports continue to be 900, but then he imports the 7 pounds worth of goods that he found in the shipwreck. This takes down his GDP to 4,393 pounds. Then for part E, it is likely that he's probably very happy with the events of part D, seeing as he's now able to experience things that he wasn't able to experience before, and his general satisfaction has probably increased. But then for part C, he was likely unhappy with the events, as this was where his huts were stolen from him. Thank you. This has been our Lab 18. We appreciate you for listening.